my fiancé demanded. I want a $350,000 wedding or no wedding at all. I replied, then there won't be one. I can't put myself in lifelong debt. So I canceled the venue, got a refund, and disappeared. Later, her dad called me begging. I, 31M, was blindsided by my fiancé's ultimatum about our wedding budget, and what happened next changed everything. 3 months ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I was planning to marry the woman I'd been with for 4 years, had a stable engineering job making decent money, and we'd just put a deposit down on a beautiful but reasonably priced wedding venue. Then everything went sideways in the span of one conversation. My fiancée came home from lunch with her sister that Tuesday, and I could tell something had shifted. She had this look in her eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of determination and something that made my stomach drop. She sat down across from me at our kitchen table and announced that she'd been thinking about our wedding plans, and they needed to change completely. I asked her what she meant, assuming she wanted to adjust the flowers or maybe switch caterers. Instead, she told me she wanted a wedding that would cost $350,000. Not $3,000, not $35,000. $350,000. I actually laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But when I saw her face, the laughter died in my throat. She was completely serious. She explained that she'd realized our original $15,000 budget was embarrassing, that her friends would judge us, and that this was supposed to be the most important day of our lives. She said she deserved a fairy tale wedding, and if I truly loved her, I would make it happen. I tried to reason with her. I explained that $350,000 was more than half of what I made in a year before taxes. I showed her our financial situation on paper, our student loans, the mortgage we were hoping to qualify for, the fact that we had maybe $20,000 in savings between us. She listened to none of it. Instead, she told me that her sister's husband had taken out loans for their wedding, that people did it all the time, and that we could figure out the money later. When I mentioned that going into massive debt for one day seemed insane, she accused me of not caring about her dreams and not being willing to sacrifice for our relationship. The conversation went in circles for hours. She had specific vendors picked out, venues researched, and what seemed like a complete plan for this extravagant wedding. I kept trying to find middle ground. Maybe we could increase our budget to $25,000 or $30,000 if we saved for another year. But she was immovable. It was $350,000 or nothing. That's when she delivered the ultimatum that changed everything. She looked me straight in the eye and told me that if I wasn't willing to give her the wedding she deserved, then maybe we shouldn't get married at all. She said a real man would find a way to make it happen, and that my reluctance showed I wasn't ready for the kind of commitment marriage required. Something cold settled in my chest as I listened to her words. This wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. The woman I'd proposed to had been practical, down to earth, and had actually suggested keeping our wedding small and intimate when we first got engaged. Now she was demanding I mortgage our entire future for one day, and questioning my love and commitment when I hesitated. I told her I needed time to think, but she said there was nothing to think about. Either I agreed to her terms, or we were done. She gave me until the end of the week to decide. I spent the next 3 days barely sleeping. I ran the numbers over and over again. Even if I could somehow secure loans for that amount, which was unlikely given our debt-to-income ratio, the payments would cripple us financially for decades. We'd never be able to buy a house, start a family, or have any financial security. We'd be paying for one day for the rest of our lives. But more than the money, something fundamental had shifted in how I saw her. The woman making these demands wasn't someone I recognized. Where was the person who used to clip coupons with me? Who got excited about finding deals at the grocery store? Who had always said she cared more about our life together than any material things? I also couldn't stop thinking about her sister's influence. Her sister had always been competitive and status conscious, but I'd never realized how much that bothered my fiancé until now. It seemed like one lunch had completely rewired her priorities, and that terrified me. If she could change this dramatically this quickly, what else might change after we were married? On Friday morning, I made my decision. I called her at work and told her we needed to talk when she got home. She seemed excited, probably thinking I was going to cave to her demands. When she walked through the door that evening, she was practically glowing with anticipation. I told her I had thought carefully about what she'd said and that I'd made my choice. I explained that I couldn't and wouldn't put us into massive debt for a wedding, and that her ultimatum had shown me something about our relationship that I couldn't ignore. I said that if she truly believed $350,000 was more important than starting our marriage on solid financial ground, then she was right. We shouldn't get married. The look on her face went from excitement to confusion to fury in about 10 seconds. She accused me of not fighting for our relationship, of giving up too easily, of being cheap and unromantic. She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life and that I'd regret it forever. I remained calm throughout her outburst, which seemed to make her even angrier. When she finally stopped yelling, I told her I'd already made arrangements to move out over the weekend, and that I'd be staying with my brother until I found my own place. I also mentioned that I'd contacted our wedding venue and would be canceling our booking the following Monday. That's when the reality of the situation seemed to hit her. She suddenly switched tactics, telling me she'd been emotional and that maybe we could compromise. She suggested we could do the wedding for $200,000 or even $100,000 if I was really concerned about money. But by then, it was too late. Her willingness to negotiate only after I'd called her bluff confirmed what I'd suspected. This had never really been about the wedding itself. I moved out that weekend while she was at her sister's house. I left my key on the kitchen counter along with a note explaining that I was sorry things had ended this way, but that I couldn't build a life with someone whose values had become so different from mine. I wished her well and asked her not to contact me while we both processed what had happened. Monday morning, I called the venue and explained the situation. They were surprisingly understanding and agreed to refund our deposit minus a small processing fee. I also canceled the few other vendors we'd already booked, losing some money but not nearly what I would have lost if I'd gone through with her demands. For the next 2 weeks, I heard nothing from her directly, though mutual friends told me she was telling people I'd abandoned her and called off our wedding over money. I didn't defend myself or try to correct the narrative. I figured anyone who knew me well enough would understand there had to be more to the story. I threw myself into work and started looking for my own apartment. My brother and his wife were supportive, letting me stay as long as I needed and listening when I needed to talk through everything. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. Then, on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after I'd moved out, my phone rang. It was her father. Her dad and I had always gotten along well. He was a practical, hard-working man who'd built his small business from nothing, and I'd always respected his work ethic and down-to-earth attitude. When I saw his name on my phone, I hesitated before answering, but ultimately decided to hear what he had to say. His voice sounded strained when I picked up. He asked if we could meet for coffee, saying he wanted to talk about what had happened between his daughter and me. There was something in his tone that made me agree to see him. We met at a diner near his office the next day. He looked tired and older than I remembered, and he got straight to the point. He told me he'd only recently learned the real reason our engagement had ended, and that he was horrified by his daughter's behavior. According to him, she'd initially told her family that I'd called off the wedding because I'd gotten cold feet about commitment. It wasn't until her sister let slip about the wedding budget demands during a family dinner that the truth came out. Her parents had been as shocked as I was about the $350,000 figure. Her father explained that he'd raised his daughter to be practical and responsible with money, and that he had no idea where these expectations had come from. He suspected her sister's influence, but admitted he was partly to blame for not seeing how competitive and materialistic both his daughters had become. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. After I'd left, his daughter had started planning the expensive wedding anyway. She'd applied for multiple credit cards and personal loans, convinced that I would come back and help pay for everything once I saw how serious she was. She'd already put deposits down on several vendors and had racked up nearly $30,000 in debt in just 3 weeks. Her father had only discovered this when she'd asked him to co-sign for a larger loan, claiming it was for a business opportunity. When he'd pressed for details, the whole story had come tumbling out. He'd immediately cut off any financial support and demanded she cancel everything. But the damage was already done. He looked at me across the table with genuine desperation in his eyes and asked if there was any way I might consider giving her another chance. He promised he'd make sure she got the help she needed to understand how irresponsible her behavior had been, and that he'd personally ensure nothing like this ever happened again. I felt sorry for him. He was clearly a good man dealing with a situation that was completely out of his control. But I also felt something like vindication. Her actions after our breakup had proven that my decision was right. If she was willing to go into massive debt, even without my involvement, What would she have done if we'd actually gotten married? I told her father that I appreciated him reaching out and that I could see how much he loved his daughter. But I explained that the woman who demanded that wedding budget and then racked up debt planning it anyway wasn't someone I could trust to be a life partner. I said that even if money hadn't been an issue, her ultimatum and her behavior afterward had shown me fundamental differences in our values that couldn't be fixed with an apology. He nodded sadly and admitted he'd expected that response, but said he'd had to try for his daughter's sake. He also apologized on her behalf for the way she'd handled everything, and said he hoped I'd find happiness with someone who appreciated the good man I was. Update 1. That conversation with her father happened 6 weeks ago, and I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Last week, I started getting text messages from her. They started innocently enough. She said she'd heard I'd talked to her father and wanted to apologize for how things had ended. She admitted she'd made mistakes and said she'd been going to therapy to work on herself. At first, I didn't respond. I'd moved into my own apartment by then and was finally starting to feel settled. I'd even gone on a few dates with a woman from work who seemed refreshingly straightforward and shared my views on financial responsibility. But the messages kept coming. She told me she'd paid off the debt from her failed wedding planning and learned her lesson about money. She said she missed me and believed we could work things out if I was willing to try. She promised that if I gave her another chance, we could have the simple wedding we'd originally planned. I was tempted to block her number, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I wanted to see if she'd actually learned anything from what had happened. After a week of messages, I finally responded. I told her I was glad she was getting help, but that I'd moved on and didn't think it would be healthy for either of us to revisit our relationship. I wished her well and asked her to respect my decision by not contacting me again. Her response was immediate and revealed that nothing had really changed. She accused me of being stubborn and unforgiving, said I was throwing away 4 years together over one mistake, and demanded to know if I was seeing someone else. When I didn't respond to that message, she sent several more, each one more desperate and angry than the last. The final message was the most telling. She wrote that she'd talked to a lawyer about whether she could sue me for breach of promise, since I'd led her on by proposing and then abandoned her when she needed me most. She said she'd spent money on wedding planning based on my promise to marry her, and that I owed her compensation. That message confirmed everything I'd suspected about her character. Even now, months later, she was still trying to find ways to make her financial irresponsibility my problem. The fact that she'd consulted a lawyer showed she was still looking for someone else to blame for the consequences of her own choices. I screenshot all her messages and saved them, just in case she actually tried to pursue legal action. Then I blocked her number and all her social media accounts. Update 2. It's been 3 months since I blocked her, and I thought I was finally free from the drama. I was wrong again. 2 weeks ago, she showed up at my apartment building. I was coming home from grocery shopping when I saw her sitting in the lobby, clearly waiting for me. My heart rate spiked when I recognized her, but I forced myself to stay calm. She looked different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes. She immediately started talking, saying she needed to see me because I wasn't answering her calls or messages. I told her I'd blocked her for a reason and asked her to leave. She followed me to the elevator, talking rapidly about how she'd changed and learned from her mistakes. She said she'd been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and that her therapist had helped her understand that her wedding demands had come from deeper issues about self-worth and family pressure. Part of me felt bad for her. She clearly wasn't doing well. But I also recognized the manipulation in her approach. She was using her mental health struggles to try to make me feel guilty for maintaining boundaries. When the elevator arrived, I got in and pressed the button for my floor. She tried to follow me, but I told her firmly that if she didn't leave the building immediately, I would call security. The desperation in her eyes was unsettling, but I held my ground. She finally stepped back as the elevator doors closed, but not before telling me she wasn't giving up and that she knew I still loved her. I immediately called the building's front desk and explained the situation to the concierge. They agreed to add her to a list of people who weren't allowed in the building without my explicit permission. I also filed a police report for harassment, though the officer warned me that unless she made specific threats or continued to show up after being told to leave, there wasn't much they could do. The next day, I got a call at work from my brother. She'd somehow found out where he lived and had shown up at his house, asking him to convince me to talk to her. My brother had told her firmly that she needed to leave me alone and stop involving other people in our personal business. That evening, I made the difficult decision to contact her parents. I called her father and explained what had been happening, the messages, showing up at my building, going to my brother's house. I told him I was concerned about her mental state and asked if they could intervene before the situation escalated further. Her father was mortified. He thanked me for calling instead of just involving the police and promised he would handle it immediately. He also apologized again for his daughter's behavior and assured me it wouldn't happen again. True to his word, the contact stopped after that call. I haven't heard from her directly in 2 weeks, though I did hear through mutual friends that her parents had gotten her into more intensive therapy and were keeping a closer eye on her activities. Final update. It's now been 8 months since I called off the wedding, and I finally feel like I can close this chapter of my life. The woman I'd been dating from work and I have become serious, and the contrast between her and my ex-fiancée couldn't be more stark. When I told her about my previous relationship and why it ended, she was supportive but not dramatic about it. She said she was glad I'd had the strength to walk away from a situation that wasn't right for me. Last month, we started talking about moving in together. The conversation was practical and mature. We discussed finances openly, talked about our long-term goals, and made sure we were compatible in all the ways that matter for a real partnership. There were no ultimatums, no manipulation, just honest communication between two adults who care about each other. I also heard the final piece of the story about my ex-fiancée through her father, who called me one last time to update me and officially apologize for his daughter's behavior. According to him, the intensive therapy had revealed some troubling patterns in her thinking. She'd apparently become obsessed with social media and keeping up with influencers and celebrities, comparing her life to carefully curated online personas. Her sister had fed into these insecurities, constantly talking about expensive purchases and lifestyle upgrades that were way beyond their family's means. The wedding demands hadn't been an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern of financial irresponsibility and unrealistic expectations that had been building for years. Her parents had been enabling it without realizing how serious the problem had become. Her father told me she was doing better with medication and therapy, but that she still struggled to accept responsibility for how she'd handled our relationship. He said he hoped that someday she'd be able to understand why I'd made the choice I did, but that he wasn't holding his breath. He thanked me again for being patient with their family during a difficult time, and said he'd always thought of me as the son-in-law he'd wanted. That conversation gave me some closure, but also confirmed that I'd made the right decision. Looking back now, I can see that the wedding ultimatum was actually a gift in disguise. It revealed who she really was before I made a legal commitment to her, before we had joint finances or children or a mortgage together. If I'd given in to her demands, I would have been trapped in a marriage with someone who valued appearances over substance, who was willing to manipulate and threaten to get her way, and who couldn't handle adult responsibilities. Instead, I'm with someone who shares my values, communicates openly, and wants to build a life together rather than just stage a performance for other people. We're talking about getting engaged next year, and when we do plan a wedding, it will be a celebration of our partnership, not a display of how much money we can spend. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried harder to make it work with my ex-fiancée, if I'd found some way to compromise or help her through whatever was driving her unreasonable demands. But then I remember her showing up at my apartment, involving my family, and threatening legal action, and I know I dodged a bullet. The whole experience taught me that love isn't enough if the fundamental values don't align. Financial compatibility, communication skills, and emotional maturity matter just as much as attraction and affection. I'm grateful I learned that lesson before it was too late to change course. My ex-fiancée wanted a fairy tale wedding, but what she really needed was to grow up. I hope she eventually does, for her own sake. But I'm glad I didn't sacrifice my financial future and peace of mind waiting for that to happen.